He understood something else, too. A man who had spent his youth where trees fell and ropes strained, learned to read angles, to judge distance by the way the light slid on bark or the slope of a cut. That sense lived in him now, a map under his skin. When the call came, faint, hurried, a voice over a field telephone that jittered and hissed, Jesse was already standing. Someone needed a spotter. Someone had to make the tanks see. Harrison hesitated in a way officers do when the rules clash with possibility, then nodded at Jesse. "You think you can do it?" he asked. Not the question of a man testing, but of one transferring a burden. Jesse did not make promises. He climbed. He went up onto the low deck of a flamethrower tank with a motion practiced in other lives. A man hauling himself onto a log, bracing as his knees found purchase. The metal under his palms was hot, dull with grime. A rain of small, angry sounds greeted him. Rifle fire skittering along the tank's flanks, the deep thump of engines, the sharp crack of grenades hitting cover. Up there, the world narrowed to a tense arc of sight and judgment. Below him, the tank crew braced, necks craned where they couldn't see. The tank's commander, a wiry man with burnished nerves, muttered a word of thanks and then an order. Wait until the spot was clear, then burn. From the deck, Jesse could see mouths in the hillside, bunker embrasures like the holes a woodchuck leaves in earth after it has eaten. They were not grand structures so much as cunning little lies of rock and timber and steel, placed to rip men apart where they came to be stubbornly alive. The flamethrower's nozzle thrummed, a mechanical animal eager for its prey. He learned then how quickly the line between saving lives and courting death can fold in on itself. Bullets chewed at the air. One tracer scored the edge of the steel near his boot. The smell of hot metal rose. A tank a few yards away took a hit in its engine block and belched smoke, creaks and groans that made the whole hillside sound like a beast in pain. Jesse kept his shoulders down, chin to chest, and spoke short, precise directions into the hiss of the battle. He became the eye the tank lacked, the extra pair of hands directing where the tongues of flame should go. Left, left, down a bit, no, lower. His voice was a breath in the cacophony, but the driver heard. When a blast of flame unfurled from the nozzle and honed into an embrasure, it did what flame does best and worst. It consumed the small interior of the bunker, roared, and collapsed a field of fire. Men who had been pinned found movement again, like a muscle relearning its use. When the tank moved forward and Jesse dropped back to another vehicle, he saw men rise from behind logs and smoke. They moved with impatient, bewildered gratitude. Over the course of that morning, Jesse would climb on and off tanks until his hands were blistered and his shirt hung heavy with sweat.
The improvisation was crude and immediate, a man on the deck guiding flame into the enemy's teeth. It was stupid in the language of doctrine and genius in the language of saving lives. Each time he exposed himself, bullets sifted past. Each time he shouted, he felt the tug of a dozen small private reckonings. Robert's absence, the weight of a childhood where men learned to solve things with their hands, the quiet record of all the small rescues he had performed before the war. There were moments when the hillside narrowed to a single, undecidable instant. A tank ahead stalled, its caterpillar track jammed by the churned mud and the bones of the slope. The crew could not move, and the tank's bow faces faced a bunker that had become a chamber of death. The men inside it were like nests of motion and steel, throwing grenades and waiting for the chaos to do them favors. The tank's flamethrower could not be brought to bear because the crew could not see how to angle it without exposing themselves further. Jesse crawled along the deck and, with his hands clamped to metal, leaned over the hatch and looked. From that vantage, he could see the ledged aperture where a defender crouched. He watched until the man made the wrong movement, a sling adjustment, a flash, and then he shouted directions to the operator. The flamethrower answered with a sheet of fire that filled the aperture, and the hillside took a long breath. When the engine finally coughed and the tank rolled on, the crew below clapped one another dumbly on the back. Not all acts ended in neat rescue. When Jesse scrambled down to pull a burning crewman clear, someone whose clothing had caught, he found hands he recognized by the way they dug into his sleeve. The crewman's face was scorched, his eyes telling a story of surprise and relief without words. Jesse wrapped his arms under the man and hauled him to the nearest stream to douse the heat. He did not kneel to examine burns beyond a pragmatic need. He rapped and dragged, and the sound of his breathing became the measure of the moment. Throughout the day, the pattern etched itself. Jesse found sight, directed flame, saved men, and moved on. The mound of enemies resisting the American advance, known in fear and rumor as the Hornet's nest, began to crumble under a method no one had written down, but which the men could see worked. Bunkers that had been stubborn points of fire fell to clean, mechanical bursts of flame. In the end, the tally read like a thin, hard fact. 42 bunkers were eliminated. The Hornet's nest was taken. Casualty lists were shorter than they would have been if field improvisation had not bridged the cold gap between armor and sight. Between bursts of action, when the slope went quiet but for the moan of engines and the occasional ringing in Jesse's ears, he saw the faces of the men he'd rescued. Men who had been asked by fate to stand in line that day now walked in a fragile, shaky line of survival. Lieutenant Harrison's hand found his shoulder at one point, a brief clasp that was almost an apology and almost a salute. Sergeant Rodriguez said things that were mostly orders, and then something softer, acknowledgement. In the tiny moments that were not claimed by fear, men made small, steady human repairs. Afterward, when the dust had settled and the command sent through its reports, the brass read the facts and noted the numerical outcomes. Officers who had been skeptics found themselves folding what had been ad hoc into plans that looked a little less unorthodox. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart, who had watched from a ridge and whose language was always that of the unit's welfare, took the account of Jesse's actions back to headquarters. He did not romanticize the man. He wrote with the dry, paper-thin respect of someone who understood that systems must serve lives. The after-action reports were terse and precise. The use of tank-mounted flamethrowers, as directed by on-deck spotters, reduced exposure of assaulting infantry and altered the approach to bunker suppression. Back in camp, Jesse received the telegram no man likes to hope for, but many dream of: recognition. It was not the simple salve of public pronouncement. It carried the weight of public record, the sort of thing that would place his name under a medal and onto a list. The medal itself, later awarded and later chronicled, would not fix what had been broken in Robert's place, nor would it make the hot months of war less complicated.
Jesse accepted the decoration with the same stoicism he had shown on the slope. Hands that had always done the work now had a small emblem to show one day's desperate inventiveness. Recognition, however, did not stop the argument between discipline and improvisation. There were officers who fretted about precedent, who feared that what worked by seat of the pants might become a ragged patchwork where rules were useful. Lieutenant Harrison argued that Jesse's method should be formalized, studied, and taught so it could be replicated safely with proper equipment and protocols. Sergeant Rodriguez fretted about soldiers exposed on tanks while bullets wedged themselves into metal. Lieutenant Colonel Hart listened to both and then set about translating a field improvisation into doctrine. Engine compartments were inspected, handholds measured and bolted, signaling methods refined so that the man on the deck could speak with the gunner without being a throat exposed to enemy fire. Manuals were edited, practices were changed. Jesse's name traveled in these sentences like a useful footnote, a thing that had happened and that had consequences. The war moved on, as wars do. Jesse returned to what remained of his life, sharpened by what he had seen and less surprised by the cruelty of a world that asked men to be brave on demand.
He went home after service, the timber country his hands remembered, and the town received him not with crowds, but with a quiet that sometimes felt like more honest praise. He worked where his body could manage the labor he preferred, hauling, sawing, fixing roofs that sagged under new storms. Children in the area knew him more for the shape of his hands than for any medal. The town church kept a photograph of the local boys who had gone to war, and Jesse's was there, in uniform, eyes not posed but steady. Years later, the tactic he had improvised found itself written into training notes and incorporated into the design of equipment. The flame remained an ambivalent symbol, one that had destroyed and one that had been used to save. But soldiers who would never meet Jesse benefited from a lesson he had learned out of pure necessity. If a tool could save lives, find a way to make the tool see. Museums that curated the implements of war displayed flamethrower tanks with placards that included his name and a modest account of the hornet's nest. Schoolchildren who filed through exhibitions asked their chaperones about bravery, and someone would explain that sometimes courage was less about gallantry than about the stubborn intelligence to climb a deck, look, and tell a man with a flame where to point it. When people spoke of him in later years, they spoke in a tone half admiration, half gentle bewilderment. He had been a working man who, by the force of a single day's choices, adjusted the calculus of battle for others. He had saved lives without seeking headlines, with the same hands he had used to move timber and later to set a young crewman onto firmer ground. The family kept his medals carefully in a drawer. There were photographs. There were remembrances at small gatherings where his brother's name would be said aloud once and then dropped into a silence where grief felt like a private relic. The flame that had been both weapon and salvation became for Jesse a complex image. He used fire to purge bunkers that had eaten men. He had also watched what fire did to the landscape, to the silence afterward. Logs, those objects of his former life, kept showing up in his mind. Heavy, stubborn, useful in ways both mundane and deep. Sometimes he would sit on a rickety porch at dusk and watch a neighbor's hearth, and the flame would look less like an enemy and more like a tool that demanded respect. Institutional change can be a slow, stubborn thing, and yet the records told a clear story.
Reports aggregated the 42 bunkers into official counts and wrote footnotes about doctrine. Engineers who later rethought flamethrower range and armor configurations cited the need to provide crews with ways to coordinate without unnecessary exposure. Even devices were altered. Handrails bolted where a shoulder might grab. Better signaling protocols to replace a shouted phrase on a deck slick with heat and rain. When people spoke of him in later years, they spoke in a tone half admiration, half gentle bewilderment. He had been a working man who, by the force of a single day's choices, adjusted the calculus of battle for others. He had saved lives without seeking headlines, with the same hands he had used to move timber and later to set a young crewman onto firmer ground. The family kept his medals carefully in a drawer. There were photographs. There were remembrances at small gatherings where his brother's name would be said aloud once and then dropped into a silence where grief felt like a private relic. The flame that had been both weapon and salvation became for Jesse a complex image. He used fire to purge bunkers that had eaten men. He had also watched what fire did to the landscape, to the silence afterward. Logs, those objects of his former life, kept showing up in his mind. Heavy, stubborn, useful in ways both mundane and deep. Sometimes he would sit on a rickety porch at dusk and watch a neighbor's hearth, and the flame would look less like an enemy and more like a tool that demanded respect. Institutional change can be a slow, stubborn thing, and yet the records told a clear story. Reports aggregated the 42 bunkers into official counts and wrote footnotes about doctrine. Engineers who later rethought flamethrower range and armor configurations cited the need to provide crews with ways to coordinate without unnecessary exposure. Even devices were altered. Handrails bolted where a shoulder might grab. Better signaling protocols to replace a shouted phrase on a deck slick with heat and rain.
Jesse's improvisation moved from being an anecdote to a template for safe adaptation. He never wrote a book. He did not lecture widely. When the museum curator asked for an oral history, he answered in plain, careful sentences about what had been necessary that morning. He spoke about seeing where the bunkers were, and about deciding that staying alive meant doing something that others had not thought to do. The recorder hummed, and the curator nodded, turning the man's story into tape like one who preserves a specimen of human decision. In the winter years, in a small funeral where the flag folded and the hymn hummed low, the town's veterans stood in a loose line and thought about the slope above the hornet's nest. They remembered the smell of burnt grass, the noise of tanks, and the roar of flame. The way a man's hand on a metal rail could mean the difference between burial and going home. They thought of Robert, too, and how memory and survival had braided into action. On the museum placard near a model of a flamethrower tank, a line recorded the simple truth. A man climbed on a tank, pointed where others could not see, and a nest of enemy bunkers was cleared. History often keeps its heroes at arm's length, with dates and counts, folding them into lists of valor. Jesse Ray Drowley's story was a little different. Less about the medal's shine and more about the practical brightening of a path that had been dark. He had done what a man with the instincts of a woodsman and the urgent business of grief might do. He improvised, he exposed himself, he chose visible risk over the hidden calculus of casualties. The result altered practice. It saved lives.
On quiet mornings, when the wind stirred and the museum's diorama took a slant of sun that made painted trees look almost like the real thing, visitors paused and read the plaque. Some shook their heads with a small, stunned respect. Others wrote a location or a name in the guest book, a family note tucked beside a simple line, "For Private Robert Drowley, remembered." And beneath the dry, instructive language of the exhibit, there was an undercurrent that the most brilliant tactics are sometimes born not from doctrine, but from the stark, precise moment when someone decides that seeing is worth the risk. If the hornet's nest had been a problem solved only by generals thinking, fewer men might have come home. Instead, the slope had yielded to an idea that was raw and human. Get the machine to look where it could not. Guide the tool with a human eye. For a working man called Jesse, that was a sort of impossible arithmetic he could understand. One person's exposed life, multiplied by the lives spared, made sense in a language he had learned hauling logs and carrying loss forward. There was, in the end, no great speech about the tactic.
Therefore, there was a small, practical set of changes, a medal in a drawer, an inscription on a placard, and the steady, quiet remembrance of men who took what they had learned and kept going. Jesse kept going too. He did not parade his courage. He wore it in the way he worked, in the way he answered when a neighbor needed a hand. The hornet's nest remained part of a larger war, a narrow story among thousands, yet in its narrowing it had taught something wider, that sometimes in the starkest need, pure desperation invents the simplest, most brilliant solution. A tank's flamethrower lit again on another diorama noon. A small visitor pointed, and a docent explained in plain words that a man had once stood where the figure stood and had shouted guidance into a storm of fire. The visitor's eyes grew wide. The old lesson was there. Not all innovations came from laboratories or lectures. Some came from the kind of stubborn courage that pushes a man up onto hot metal and out into the open, because he could not bear to watch otherwise. The hillside where the hornet's nest had been returned to quiet over the years. Trees reclaimed ridges. Pathways grew over with moss. But the map of memory kept the line sharp. A man climbed, a flamethrower burned. 42 bunkers were silenced, and a nest of defenders fell. The units who fought there adapted their manuals. The engineers revised schematics. The men who returned home told the story in a way that carried both sorrow and a practical pride. For Jesse Ray Drowley, the act did not make him famous in the way headlines do. It made him responsible in a narrow, enduring sense. A maker of a way to survive. The sun climbed higher over a museum window, and a small child traced the outline of a tank in the dust on the glass. Somewhere, a veteran who had been there lit a cigarette with hands that remembered heat and smoke for other reasons. Between the two, the story sat like a tool left on a workbench. Useful, a little scarred, not much to look at, and worth everything when it was needed. The veteran's hand trembled only when he took the cigarette from his pocket and struck a match. He cupped the flame, as if to keep the tiny light from being snatched by some remembering wind. The match hissed once, then went out. He struck another, and the little flare steadied. The action was ordinary and private. The same motion a man used to bring a flame to a stove, to a lantern, to a stove that would not warm enough. Around him, the museum hummed with voices that had no need of the past he carried. Children ran their fingers along rope barriers and asked their parents why the tanks had teeth like dragons. The veteran watched them and moved his lips as if forming names that had long lost the need to be spoken aloud. Jesse Ray Drowley lived in a house that ran long along the edge of town, its porch leaning gently toward a yard where pine needles kept their own slow calendar.
He a drawer in his kitchen where he kept the metal, a yellowed handkerchief, a photograph of two young men with something like shock and daring in their faces. The drawer was ordinary, a place for coupons and small tools, until the light fell on the metal and the world narrowed. Sometimes he opened it and did nothing more than set the palm of his hand on the cool circle, as if feeling the copper could make his chest settle. He did not tell stories much. When neighbors asked, people who had children and jobs and a curiosity sharpened by a need to understand, the talk stayed simple and workmanlike. He would say, "We did what we had to," and then change the subject to crops, to the repair of a roof, to the price of gas. The men who had been with him called sometimes. They left messages that were mostly steady and practical. A reminder about the veterans' meeting next Thursday. A question whether Jesse could bring a fold-up chair. An update about another friend's health. They spoke in a language of listed needs and small courtesies. When the men came by, they sat on Jesse's porch and drank coffee from paper cups and did not try to tear the place open with questions. They only touched it with the cautious tenderness of men who knew there were wounds that did not want to be looked at. On a late autumn morning, a woman arrived at his door carrying a notebook. She was a volunteer at the museum. She had the look of someone for whom the past was work and the present a calendar. Her name was Ellen Pratt, and she asked if she might speak with him for a short piece they were assembling, the kind of local feature that tried to put faces to placards. Jesse hesitated in the kitchen doorway, hand on the metal drawer, then stepped aside and let her in. Ellen was polite and quick and used no grand words. She asked about the day on the hill as if it were a blueprint she needed to read. She wanted the facts and then the small particulars. What had been said, what had not been said. Jesse answered in the measured sentences he had learned from the army and from years of making things. Straight lines, no frills. He did not mention the fear that had been a drumbeat in his ribs for decades. He omitted the dreams in which the flamethrower's hiss returned and the faces of men were lit and then folded like paper. When Ellen asked if he had thought often of Robert, Jesse closed his eyes for a moment. His hand lingered on the drawer. "Every day," he said. "Even the ones that seem ordinary. You can't ask a man to forget his brother." She asked if there was a place he went to when he needed to talk to the thing that had followed him home. He considered saying the museum or the cemetery, but the answer that came was smaller and more human. "There's a ridge out by Miller's Road," he said. "Not the Battle Hill, different. I like to stand up there and see the line of trees. It makes me remember that things keep growing."
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: "It makes me remember that things keep growing." Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão.
Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. There were nights when the house felt too large for one man, and the radio was only a backdrop of weather and static. He would take the metal from the drawer and hold it until the metal went warm. Once, in a fit of restlessness, he drove to the base where many of the men had trained. The gates were closed, but he parked his truck at a distance and walked where the parade ground had been. The light that day was thin and sharp. Grass grew where faces had once stood. He thought of the neat diagrams that tried to compress movement into arrows and boxes. The diagrams could not hold the sounds. The language of a voice shouting over a roar, the smell, the staggering grief. Those were details the maps left out. Some of his neighbors knew as much as they needed to. That Jesse could mend anything from a broken fence to a stubborn engine. That he had the instincts of a woodsman and a patience for things that took time. Others knew less, and built a version of him out of the stories that passed in the diner. An image of a man on a tank, of putty and courage and a medal. The truth sat between those accounts like a nut in a log, dense and not easy to cut through. Spring arrived with an invitation. The museum was hosting a day to honor the innovations that had grown from necessity, and they wanted to present a small recognition to the men whose quick thinking had altered practice. Ellen called and then drove out to his house when he did not answer the phone. She found him working on a neighbor's porch repair and told her she would not take no for an answer. "It's simple," she said. "We're not making you give a speech. We just want you there, for the record." He thought about it. The idea of standing before a crowd tightened his throat. But there was a ledger of reasons to go. Letters in the shoebox, the boy's face, the men who had left messages. He told Ellen he would come. The day of the event, the museum lawn filled with people in windbreakers and Sunday jackets, with veterans wearing caps and students from the local high school who had shown up for extra credit. The sun attempted to be warm and fell just short, and there was a smell of grilled food from a stall set up near the entrance. A small stage had been erected with flags that made a neat border around a microphone. Jesse sat near the back, a chair that felt like another tool, useful when needed, unremarkable. When his name was called, the crowd's attention gathered in a way that made him aware of the mechanics of being looked at. He rose and walked to the stage with a gait that had been trained by years of hauling wood and stepping carefully over roots. He took the microphone, and there was a hum of expectation, a desire for a narrative tidy enough to be told in 5 minutes, with all the moral properly placed. He could have given them that speech, the tale of necessity turned into doctrine. But instead, he did what he had always done. He kept to the practical and the honest.
"I'm not good at preaching," he said, and the laugh that followed came from people who had never needed to be brave in the same way. "There are things I remember that I don't want to make pretty. We lost men. We learned. That's the most anyone can say without making up more than happened." He spoke about seeing, how a human eye, when put into a place a machine could not reach, offered an advantage the engineers had not thought to draw. He described the slope, the smell, the way metal felt hotter than the day would suggest, and then he paused. "If I had a message," he said, "it's that sometimes the thing that saves a man is another man deciding he can't stand by. That sort of math doesn't have a formula. It has a face." Afterward, people came forward. The boy from the museum stood to the side with his notebook, and an older woman pressed a folded letter into Jesse's hand and said, "For Robert." A man from one of the units, older and softer with the years, gripped Jesse's shoulder and said, "You kept us going." The words were small and imperfect, but they were given as one trades a piece of equipment to a neighbor, with expectation and with the hope of repair. Jesse left the museum with the medal in his pocket and a feeling that was not victory but reckoning. The town would remember the portrait the museum had painted. The engineers would revise another diagram. The manuals would hum on in barracks and classrooms. But memory would also fold into kitchen drawers and shoeboxes and quiet ridges. It would be carried in paper cups on porches, and in the hush that follows when a man admits, in the plainest terms, that he did what he had to. That evening he drove out Miller's Road. The ridge was an easy walk from the turnout, a small climb where the trees thinned and the view opened to a line of hills. He stood where the land sloped away and watched the sun go gold over the town. The world had a kind of sharpness then, the edges of things keen and clear. He thought of the men who had not come home, and the ones who had. He thought of Robert with the clarity of a man who had finally allowed himself to say everything that had been packed and stored for years. "Wish you'd seen this, Bob," he said aloud, though neither the wind nor the trees could answer in a way that mattered. He let the metal touch his palm through the pocket and felt the warmth of his own hand. Down below, the town went on with its ordinary cares. The museum lights blinked faintly as guides prepared to lock up, and a truck idled at the diner where men argued over politics they meant to control. Jesse stayed on the ridge until the light left the world, and only a thin blue line remained between land and sky. Then he walked back to the truck with the sure, slow steps of a man who had done what he could and had learned to live after. The next morning there was a call from a name he did not recognize.
It was a journalist from a national program wanting to know if he would appear on camera to tell his story. He listened to the polite enthusiasm on the other end and felt the old resistance flare. Fame was not his aim. The metal sat in a drawer and did not need a stage. He told them he would think about it, then set the phone down and went to work on Mrs. Halloran's fence. That was how his life moved. Small acts of repair, sudden intrusions of attention, back to the stoop and the toolbox. Sometimes he wondered if the tales would change. What a boy on a tank would look like in the telling. How a single moment might be dressed in battle hymns until it no longer resembled what it had been. He was not afraid that the facts would be muddled. He was afraid that the reasons would be lost. The raw human arithmetic that had made a man climb. There were other moments of reckoning that the museum's plaque could not hold. At night, in the quiet, he would think of the men he had seen trusting him, of how much of that trust had been a challenge and how much had been a comfort. He would recall the simple, irrational faith of a man on a tank shouting directions into a storm. Not a faith in fancy doctrine, but a faith in doing. It was the kind of faith that fit in a pocket and could be set beside a lamp. Spring would come again, and with it more visitors, more questions. He knew that the story would travel like the seeds of the pine trees, carried by small gusts and taking root in places he could not predict. He accepted that he could not tend every shoot that sprouted. What he could do was be present when the young asked, and honest when asked. He could refuse the spectacle and offer instead the work of a neighbor who mends fences and keeps a drawer full of quiet proof. When the next letter arrived, this one from the family of a man whose life had been changed by the slope, a man now working as a teacher and raising a son, Jesse read it twice and folded it carefully. He set it in his shirt pocket, feeling the paper's slight bulk like a small human weight. He would carry it to the ridge the next time he went, and he would think of Robert and of men who re-entered life by degrees. At the edge of town, where the museum sign caught the light in a way that made the letters seem more permanent than were possible, a group of children gathered to sketch tanks and trees. A docent watched them with a patient eye, and somewhere a veteran lit a cigarette and remembered heat that had nothing to do with the current weather. The stories continued to find their places, some in placards, some in drawers, some in the slow speech of men on porches. Jesse drove home, the shoebox of letters in the passenger seat, the metal heavy and small in his pocket. He had no illusions about being an architect of history. He was a man who had climbed because he could not watch otherwise, who had returned to a life that required work and a willingness to answer when a neighbor knocked. The world would keep its plaques and dioramas. He would keep the things that mattered to him, the names, the small proofs, the ridges where trees still grew. He parked, took the metal from his pocket for a moment, and then let it rest back into its drawer. Outside, the night settled, and the house held its quiet. For now, that was enough. He had done what he had to do, and he would go on doing the small tasks of living, repairing fences, answering calls, walking the ridge. The past would not be quieted by medals or by speeches. It would be carried, as it always had been, by men who kept their hands busy and their memories honest. Somewhere in town, the guest book at the museum lay open on a small table, a new entry penciled in with a boyish hand. For PVT Robert Drowley, remembered. The words were simple and small, and, like most small things, true enough. The museum lights dimmed, the diorama's painted trees took on the cold gray of evening, and the world closed around the ordinary work of keeping memory close without turning it into a trophy. Jesse, in his house, turned off the kitchen light and went to bed with the weight of names and the softness of a life continued. He slept the sleep of a man who had put one foot after another and had learned, finally, to keep going. He opened the kitchen drawer the next morning and touched the metal as if testing its coolness, then folded the newest letter and slid it back into the shoebox. The light came in thin and obedient through the curtains. Outside, a robin chose the porch rail and seemed to argue with the morning about whether it would sing. Jesse made coffee, poured it into the chipped mug he used 3 mornings out of 5, and did not rush. There are mornings that have work built into them, and mornings that ask only to be held. This was the latter. He had not intended to go to the museum that day. He supposed he had never intended many of the things that now threaded through his weeks. But the shoebox felt heavier with the letters accumulated, and there was a quiet, particular pressure in him to answer in some small way the pile of gratitude that had stacked into his life. So he drove the short distance, keeping the shoebox in the passenger seat like a child asleep, and parked beside the sign that gleamed in the new light. Inside, the museum was doing what museums do. It turned the past into an arrangement of objects that could be walked around, scrutinized, and left. Children still drew tanks near the diorama. A docent explained the way a winch worked to a pair of boys who were more interested in the levers. Jesse moved among them like a man following small footprints. When he reached the table where the guest book lay open, he did not sign. He set the shoebox down and opened it, letting the paper cents rise in a slow, private salute. A man approached before Jesse had read more than the first note.
He was not the sort of man who announces himself by the timbre of his voice. He announced himself by the steadiness with which he stood in a place. He introduced himself as Mark Ellis, teacher, father, and then apologized for bothering Jesse. The apology was unnecessary and honest both, and Jesse listened to the way Mark's hand tightened on a small boy's shoulder. "This is my son," Mark said, "Eli. Eli's been asking about the slope. He heard about the men who climbed, and he wanted to see the tank." Eli held a pencil stub and a folded sketchbook. He looked like many boys, earnest, a little ashamed of his hands for not being useful enough. Mark held out an envelope. "We wrote to thank whoever it was. My boy, he says thank you for the day his father got back." Jesse thought of the letter in his pocket, the one he had read twice, and set in his shirt as if it were a coin that could prove the world. He thought of the teacher named in it, not a name he would have guessed, because people change into what they need to be after events. Some become gardeners, some become teachers, some become fathers who teach other fathers what gentleness looks like. He had not expected to meet any of them in person. He had expected to carry their thanks in a shoebox and in his chest. "You're welcome," he said. It sounded small. He wanted it to be enough. Mark asked gently whether Jesse might tell the boys what had happened on the slope. He did not ask for medals or a speech. He only asked if Jesse would tell the story so that it would be told without the loud and glittering accretions that so often find such things. "We want them to know what courage looks like when it's not in a painting," Mark said. "We want them to hear that sometimes the brave thing is to climb because someone needs a hand." Jesse looked at Eli, at the pencil marks on the boy's fingers, at the way a child's mouth made the word soldier into something tender. He thought for a moment of how easily a moment becomes a monument, and how easily monuments become ornaments, admired but not useful. He remembered, too, the men who had trusted him then, how their trust had been rough and immediate, how it had steadied him the way a rope steadies a man on a ladder. "All right," he said, "but not with anyone from the paper. No ceremony. I'll talk to your class, quietly. Tell the kids the truth of it. That's what you want, isn't it? The small truth?" Mark's relief was almost visible. Over the next hour, they arranged a weekday visit, a Tuesday morning, when the school could bring a small group. Jesse agreed on terms that surprised him. He would bring nothing but a few ordinary items from his toolbox, and he would sit on the edge of the classroom floor and tell them plainly, in the voice he used when he fixed a hinge or coaxed a stubborn nail home. When Tuesday came, he found himself nervous in the way a man is nervous before doing something that matters but is not spectacular. A historia could keep viagers, sometimes landing where it would be used well and sometimes not. But those who have been moved by it, the teacher who taught his son gentleness, the veteran who taught a neighbor how to repair a door, carried it in ways that medals never could. On a cool morning, Jesse walked to the ridge and sat where the wind could speak freely. He took the shoebox up from the car and opened it, reading a few lines and folding them back into their places. He let the space between the trees and the slope remind him of what had been true then.
that courage is often a series of choices, and that a single act can bend the future only so far as people choose to carry its lessons. A boy down near the museum sketched the tank with careful, honest strokes. Jesse watched him for a while and then rose, the muscles remembering the habits of a life spent moving between tasks. He shouldered his toolbox, the weight familiar and good, and walked down the trail toward the town. There were fences to mend, voices to answer, letters to fold, and perhaps one more small classroom waiting for a man who had learned to say the truth plainly. He had not planned on becoming anything grander than a man who kept going. That, he thought, as the town's roofs gathered the sun, was enough. He had done what he had to do, and he would keep doing it. The steady, ordinary work of living that honors what comes before without turning it into spectacle. He put one foot in front of the other and went on.